And last week, and this chapter, I had to go back after last week's debacle, go back and just refresh myself on this, what Guthrie's doing. The remainder of this chapter is specifically discussing natural revelation. And then when we get to the next chapter, we'll dive into special revelation. So in the beginning of the chapter, we talked a little bit about both. So we can understand where we sit. This section will just talk from here on for the completion of this area. We're going to be on natural revelation.
Where are we starting in the notes?
We are on Roman numeral 4.
Okay.
Right now.
Very good.
All right, so we ended up with last week with 3 Christian positions, right? We had the deist position, an incomplete picture that God can, that we can walk so far by observing nature, and that God can then meet us there, and then a denial to any validity at all, saying that as a staunch Reformed theologian, no. You cannot have any knowledge about God unless God moves to you 100%. Going to the fall in the garden and saying in the garden, and you look at the creation myth, that Adam and Eve are cut off because of their sin. They're spiritually dead, right? And then eventually they will physically die later on, right? So you have 3 positions. One, a deist, which is like, God just winds up the universe, lets it run. The second one is saying that people can look at nature and look at creation and come to some type of an understanding of a higher power, and that's where God then moves in through the Spirit and enlightens us through special revelation, and then no, at all, this cannot happen, right? And so now we are in Roman numeral 4 of Guthrie's notes, the search for a solution. And Guthrie writes, the debate about the validity of general revelation is more important than may appear at first glance. It is because he rejected all natural theology that Karl Barth, was able to speak so effectively as he called the churches in Germany to acknowledge the sole authority of Jesus Christ over their thought and life. The German Christians claimed to find the will of God in an ideology of blood and soil. This is a little powerful right now reading this, thinking about the current events that are going on in our own nation. And in the destiny of a super race, Barth wrote, the fellowship of those belonging to the church is not determined by blood, therefore not by race, but by the Holy Spirit and baptism. If the German evangelical church excludes Jewish Christians or treats them as a lower grade, she ceases to be a Christian church. But we only have to change 2 words to make the last sentence read, if the American church excludes members of any racial ethnic minority or treats them of a lower grade, she ceases to be a Christian church.
Amen.
So, and that can be done with any nation.
Could you read that sentence again, please?
Which one? The last one?
Uh-huh.
All right. If the American church excludes members of any racial ethnic minority or treats them as of a lower grade, she ceases to be a Christian church. So what Guthrie has done is taken Barth's statement and tweaked it to our understanding being from our nation. But I think Guthrie did that so we can understand that you can take any country and place it in that area. Guthrie, of course, is an American, so he is speaking to our audience, right, who we are. But Guthrie did that so we can understand, hey, it doesn't matter where you are. You don't have to be in, Germany to have this go on. It could happen anywhere.
What is the status of the Mormon Church right now? Do you know? Because I know about 35 years ago when I was in Hollywood, they still, if you were black, you couldn't be a member.
No,
I believe that's changed.
Definitely. They have commercials with black people.
Right.
That's changed.
I know there was a huge thing with a bunch of Hollywood stars trying to...
That's changed. I don't know much about Mormon theology, but I know that has changed.
And when he said that sentence in his book, is there a Bible verse or section that
No,
alludes
what
to?
he's quoting, I'm almost positive, I believe he's quoting the Barman Declaration. I have to find,
Of our denomination.
it's part of our confessions,
Yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
Right.
I don't believe the footnotes are on the back of the book.
But I think you could derive that from the Good Samaritan, if nothing else.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know,
Mhm. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
definitely,
That's right.
Oh, yeah, and keep in mind that Bart is living in this time period, right? Bart helps pen the Barman Declaration, right? He is watching his people, he's watching his country fall into this web.
Well, what year is this?
This is, well, the Barman Declaration is written right before, right, the beginning of
30s, right?
early 30s.
1930s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
So he is taking a stance with a bunch of Lutherans, clergy and Reformed clergy, and standing up against Nazi ideology. And this is in the beginning. This is not the end, or this is not, so they put marks on themselves very early as they're opposing what's going on. So, these are bold steps for any clergy at this point. We see then that the discussion of the place of natural theology is not a hair-splitting debate of interest only to technical theologians. Important issues are involved here for all Christians. How we understand God and the meaning of our lives, how we relate Christianity to other religions, how we go about evangelism and missions, and even how we stand on political, social, and economic issues. Every area of Christian thought and life will be influenced by the decisions we make at this critical point. So, what Guthrie is now going to do is look at some pros and cons, or arguments for the natural understanding of God, the natural revelation of God, and against it. Because remember, and this is right at the end of what we talked about last week, right? And the basis of this is saying, can we understand God by nature? Just by natural revelation, is it possible for us to do so? Or, no, we can't, right? So remember, we had an incomplete picture saying that we can go only so far, and then God comes in and walks us the rest of the way.
Mm.
And then a denial to any validity is saying, no, we cannot, right? So, looking at then point 1 on Guthrie's notes, it would be arrogant and blind to argue that there is no knowledge of God except in Jesus Christ and biblical revelation. So, especially in a postmodern world, to say that Jesus is the only way to understand God is arrogant, right? How do we see that? How can that be seen as arrogant? I know it's hard because you're all Christians, but how can that be seen as arrogant?
Well, it's exclusive.
Yeah, it's exclusive.
Say it again.
It would be arrogant and blind to argue that there is no knowledge of God at all except in Jesus Christ and biblical revelation. Saying that,
So saying that Hindus and whatever cannot know God at all.
right,
That for them there is no choice.
there is, right. And that
Closer to
That
home,
is,
Jews
that is
and-
arrogant.
I mean, eventually.
Muslims.
that would also probably
Yeah.
throw Jews into that
And Muslims.
mixture. And Muslims,
And
yes.
those that don't believe in anything.
And right, agnostics, atheists,
Who are we to
everybody.
say?
Well, they are going to hell.
Right, that's everybody. And so, yes, it's saying that unless you come from the Christian perspective or Christian worldview, there is none. All right. I'm not saying this, remember, Guthrie he's listing against, and then he's going to list for, right? Or this is for, and then he will list against. So that's the first thing, to say that you have to exclusively be a Christian to be able to get any revelation at all that there is a higher power out there, a power greater than us, right? So that's one. 2, some Christians are eager to recognize that a limited knowledge of God is available to all people, because they want to show that non-believers are without excuse in not knowing and serving God. All right, this is a little
There's a
verbose.
scriptural passage somewhere that
Yes, yeah.
confirms that.
yeah. So some Christians are eager to recognize that a limited knowledge of God is available to all people because they want to show that non-believers are without excuse in not knowing about God. So, without excuse, and is there a Bible in here? There is. I hate to take one. Yeah. Don, since you brought it up, and Don is correct, can you read for us Romans 1, 18 to 23? The scholar in the back.
Yeah.
He nailed it. He nailed it.
The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, Guthrie pretty much just lifted that, yeah, and put it there. So if you are saying that there is something to natural revelation, it's not that theologians are just pulling this out of thin air. You know, they will build it up with also references from the Bible, as Don pointed out. Right? And that's a big one. That's a big one. That's to say that we have no excuse. There is evidence all around us of a God.
Yeah, that's definitely natural.
Yeah, that's natural revelation.
Right.
Right? It's not talking about the Spirit moving, right? Today in church, we talk about Peter's declaration of Jesus being the Christ. And Jesus makes, of course, on this rock, not so much on you, Peter, but on your statement, I will build my church. And Jesus says, this did not come from you. You knew this because the Father gave you this information. That's divine revelation. To say that, there are things about God that we just can't pull out of by sitting outside and looking at a cardinal. Now we can say, you can look at a cardinal according to Romans and say, what a beautiful bird. Nature is absolutely breathtaking at times. There has to be something else. Maybe there's something else other than me and my friends and all the people running around in this place, right? So any direct knowledge about Jesus, right? This is what special revelation is. It comes from God. All right. 3, the knowledge of God's existence that is available to all furnishes us with a good beginning point in evangelism. How do you evangelize if people can only have a special knowledge, right?
Right.
It's like,
Then we have to pass on that special knowledge, introduce them to it.
right. But do we pass on special knowledge?
Right. But
And this is the fun thing
it's-
about theology now.
if
We don't pass on special knowledge, we can only point out things. Good.
Right.
What were you going to say, Andy?
Well, just that, if you're purely special revelation, then yeah, there is no point in prophetizing. You just say, wow, I hope God moves that dude because I can't do anything for him.
Right. 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 Yeah. In essence, yeah. That's correct. We've heard similar arguments about predestination. If Christians are predetermined, to receive God's invitation or special revelation, why even evangelize? And that's an argument I hear even today
Yeah.
amongst Reformed theologians. So this says that this, natural revelation is a good starting point, because you are able to say, well, take a look around you. Do you think this is all an accident?
Right.
Yeah. So it does. It furnishes Christians with a good starting point when we think about evangelism. That it's not just something, like Andy said, you pat him on the back. Well, I hope God.
Good luck.
Good luck. I'm already in, so, And it's interesting because when you think about theology, even as we think about the church, we do not.
There was a guy that just came in, and I asked him what he wanted, so I wouldn't have found pictures for your little boy. And I go, can I help you? He goes, it's
Wait.
a minister here.
Took pictures of whose little boy?
I'm going to draw a picture of your little boy, but there's a guy that just came in the door, and I go, do you need some help? He goes, it's a minister here, and I said, yes, well, I'll go get him.
Somebody looking for the minister.
Yeah,
Looking
there's
for
a
you.
guy that's out there, and I don't know who he is. I've never seen him before. Come here.
Oh.
I will take care of that.
You sure you want to?
We'll see.
She can yell.
Okay. Okay. All right. So that's number 3. Number 4, we must take seriously what can be known about God from the light of nature and the works of creation, because the Bible itself invites us to do
Always
so.
told him to go downstairs, get a cup of coffee or something.
Okay.
Want to sit in the class?
Oh,
Yeah, we're in class.
oh, here he is, John.
Okay. Thank you,
Here
Miriam.
he
Your
is.
name is?
Morning.
Sorry,
This is our pastor.
Morning, Bill.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Ben.
How are you?
Welcome.
Would you like to sit with us, or would you like to have some coffee?
All right. So what Guthrie is saying is that there are, for us to ignore natural revelation, you're ignoring pieces of Scripture. And so Don read us the piece from Romans a few moments ago, but there are others that talk about God within creation. Lots of the Psalms talk about the wonders of God through creation. The book of Acts and other scriptures in Romans. So this is not just, the piece that Don read is not just an isolated piece. There are other scriptures that tell us that you can take from creation an understanding of God. Now, looking against arguments against the natural knowledge of God, we'll take those same steps, but look at them in a different way. Because theology is an interesting thing. We all have one Bible to work off of. It's not, sometimes when you listen to things and you wonder, like, what are you reading? Where does that come from? And yet, the person who you are debating with or discussing with is using the same Bible you're using, right? So remember, you are interpreting these passages, but you interpret them, as Guthrie would say, with the lens
Right.
that you are taught, right? So as Reformed theologians, you look at them from that Reformed lens. If you were Roman Catholic, you look at them from a Roman Catholic lens. Orthodox, from an Orthodox lens. And within our Book of Order, it even says, hey, we don't own, the copyright on this. There are other denominations, other ways of looking at it. This is how we look at it and how we understand it. And so when we think about that, there's only one Bible. And yet there are so many different ways that people look at it and interpret it. All right, so looking at the arguments against the natural knowledge of God under B, 1. The arguments for the existence of God are not convincing, and therefore it is very questionable whether an analysis of the world and ourselves leads us even to preliminary knowledge of God. So Guthrie is saying the arguments against it, it's not convincing. It doesn't convince anybody. And it's questionable to say, oh, look, look at that beautiful pine tree. There must be a God. Guthrie's saying, would you just not look at that pine tree and say, it's a beautiful pine tree? No? 2, the result of looking outward at the world or inward at ourselves is not only uncertainty about the existence of God, but also uncertainty about God's nature. What can we glean from that? Except that if you say that there is a higher power that creates nature, creation, or humanity, it really, what does it say about God's nature? It really, unless we say, well, God created this. Oh, okay. God created it. But what does that mean about God? It doesn't give us anything, according to this argument.
Right. So you can say, okay, there's a God, but it doesn't necessarily say, therefore, be a good person necessarily.
Exactly.
Right.
Very good. Yes.
Actually, can give you the opposite idea.
Yeah, I mean,
When you
sometimes
see
our-
all the
some
wars
things
and
are
the
not very
famines
nice.
and
Yes.
everything else,
Yeah.
it's really,
Yeah.
Nature is
Right.
ruthless.
In the world,
Right.
Why
it
shouldn't
throws
that
a
be,
monkey
right?
wrench into
Yeah,
it.
we look at what goes on in nature, and it's
Often brutal.
dog eat, dog kill world. So we look at how humanity acts against each other, or even at nature, right? You can observe a predator taking down dinner. It's rough. I mean, every time my rat terrier goes outside, I fear for the wildlife that lives in my backyard. She's killed 2 birds, 2 field mice, and a mole as of the day of the eclipse. Dug them right out of the ground and killed them. So, when you look at nature, nature is beautiful, but nature can also be brutal. Look at Texas right now.
Yeah.
I mean, nature on its best day is absolutely breathtaking. And then there are times, I lived in Florida a long time. When hurricanes blow in, you prepare.
It's not
Yeah.
pretty.
You prepare. It's not pretty at all. I mean, they are massive and powerful, and you have no control. You have zero control, except when they tell you to get out, you get out.
Plus, nature gave the Greeks and the Egyptians everything pantheons. When they didn't give them
Oh, most
only one
definitely.
god, they had like
Yeah.
gazillion gods. So
Yeah, and think about their understandings of God, and that's a perfect example, Suhail. When you think about the ancients, Egyptians, Greeks, the Romans, Mesopotamians, when they came up with their pantheons of gods, and think about their concept of what a god was. Wrathful, angry. You screw up, Zeus starts hurling lightning bolts down on you,
or
right?
takes your wife.
What? Well, or steals your wife. Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so,
Pranksters.
right,
Yeah.
pranksters. I mean, you as people would actually pray and light incense and give coin to hope that they would not, fall under these categories because these gods were mean and rough. They were. And so, just thinking what they observed from nature, right? I mean, they did have the gods of the, of the harvest. There were Ceres. There were, those gods, but there were also a lot of mean, mischievous gods. And that, like Suhail says, when you look at nature, nature can be beautiful, but nature can also be absolutely brutal. So if we just go by that,
Right.
it's, we learn from what we are, immersed in, then that can be rough.
Yeah, and they concluded that there were a whole bunch of different gods in
Everything.
charge of different things rather than one god over the whole thing.
Exactly, correct. Because their whole system, their whole pantheon is based on their observation.
Right.
I mean, even to the Romans and the Greeks, you get drunk, not because of fermentation, you get drunk because Bacchus did this, right? Or Dionysus did this.
That's a good god, isn't it?
It's a good guy. That's right. All right, 3. The knowledge of God, we think, we derive from an analysis of the world around us, or from our experience, is untrustworthy, not only because it is uncertain and ambiguous, but also because it is inevitably distorted by our sinfulness. Remember, I talked a little bit earlier that it's interpretation. When I preach every Sunday, it's my interpretation of what I've read, what I've studied. And my interpretation, what gets poured into that is everything about me. Starting as far back as was I hugged enough as a kid. What I grew up, how I grew up, what my home life was like, my education. Did I grow up with not enough or too much? Everything impacts the way we interpret anything in life, includes Scripture, right? So, when we look out at nature, according to Guthrie, how we interpret it is shaded by our own sinful nature, by our own broken selves. So that impacts it. So you're having a good day, wow, look at this, absolutely beautiful. Oh, God is so good. You're having a bad day, man, God really hates my guts. I think about the movie Bruce Almighty that we watched this past summer as Bruce Nolan, right? He says God is like that, a giant sitting up top the anthill with a giant magnifying glass burning off my feelers. And we laugh because it's funny, but there are times where we all think like this. And that's why it hits us, because it's very relevant. It's very relevant. I'm sure if we all thought about it, there were all times somewhere in our life where you wonder, am I cursed? What's going on here? Hello? The psalmist talked about it all the time. Think about the Psalms. How long, O Lord, will you forsake me? It's not that the psalmist hates God. The psalmist wants to see God, but the psalmist does not see God. Right? How long, O Lord? The psalmist is saying, show me, where are you? Psalmist is angry, wants to feel the presence of God, but doesn't. Right? So we think about our own interpretations, and Guthrie says they're shaded. They're imperfect because we are imperfect. Because of our sinful nature, or because of this broken condition that we all reside in, are we really going to have this understanding of God? What's it going to be like? It's going to be just as broken as we are. This is where we all get tripped up sometimes when we think about this. We are created in the image of God, and sometimes humanity turns it the other way and puts God as created in our image. And we do that sometimes. We all could fall in that pitfall. Because we want God to say what we want God to say, and it doesn't work that way. All right. 4, a natural knowledge of God based on our own reason and experience is impossible, not only because of our sinful nature, but because of God's transcendent nature. God is far beyond and above anything we can think or imagine. Can't do it. We are finite beings. How can we even process or begin to process what God is like without special revelation? Can't do it. We look at the Greeks, we look at the Romans, we look at the Mesopotamians and their systems that they came up with. It pales. It's nothing like how we understand God through special revelation. And that starts with the Jews, right? So it starts with, we have like the burning bush, right? God reveals God's self to Moses. God reveals God's self to Job in the whirlwind, right? God reveals God's self to the disciples in Jesus Christ, right? So we get this. We understand about God because God says, here I am. It's time, But could we, even with our finite minds, grasp anything about what God truly is without God reaching out to us first? And that's what number 4 says, that you can't do it. We can't. All you would have are some kind of thing, mythology. And mythology, when you look at our ancient ancestors, today, we love reading mythology. It's fun. We do it too. It's called comic books. Right? We have superheroes. And Stan Lee, who is the father at Marvel Comics, even says it. comic superheroes are nothing but our own mythology, our own systems that we created. Because as kids, who didn't love reading Greek? I love Greek mythology. I love that stuff. It's fascinating. Great stories. I mean, the story of Icarus, fantastic. These are great stories. And they have, meanings to them, right? Listen to your dad, kids, right? If you have kids, that's the one you want to teach your kids. Listen to your old man, right? You fly too close to the sun, the wax melts, you're toast. And your old man's going to make it to the mainland. And you're shark bait. Right? So think about what the ancients talked about and think about how we understand Jesus. Totally different. Totally different. We cannot make that connection. We just can't do it. Our minds won't allow it because they're not there. All right, 5. Those who want to depend only on special revelation argue that their position is supported and not undermined by the texts that are at first glance seem to indicate general knowledge of God. Remember we talked about this, right? The last one, saying that, in Psalms, in Romans, there are these texts that talk about this understanding of God. It's out there. It's there, right? But the writers are part of that religious community. So the last sentence is saying that, the psalmist can look out at creation and say, look at that cedar. How could you not understand that's a creation of God? Well, that writer of the Psalms is a Jew. He's now been involved in this community for centuries, right? His history is with his people. Or for Christians to say, how could you not look at that cardinal and say, my God, that bird is absolutely beautiful. God created that beautiful bird. Okay. But in this sentence, in that statement, would say, well, yeah, sure. You have already been given that special revelation. God has already moved you to the point. So, of course, you would understand that that cardinal is created by God. Or that cedar, that mighty cedar, is created by God. Right? Because it's already there, you've already been given that. You are writing. Anyone who writes, who has worked with biblical writings, they're part of this community. These are not outsiders who sit down and say, oh, wow, look at that, let me write this. Okay, here, now you read this. It didn't work like that, right? So what they're saying is, the last sentence is saying that, okay, yes, they are in the Bible, these statements about nature. But everyone who wrote them, they're already part of that community. Whether it be the Jews or Christians, they've already had the ability given to them because they had that special revelation by God. So they're part of the community already. If they were extra biblical, outside of that community, Guthrie would say, then it would be different. But they're not. They're not. Atheists and agnostics, well, perhaps agnostics do, and atheists do too, study the Bible, but not to worship. You see what I mean?
Study it as literature.
Yeah, studied as literature. Where we study it as literature, but it's also something else for us, or for Jews. It's something different. It's sacred to us. Like the Quran is sacred to a Muslim. Like the,
Bhagavad Gita.
the Bhagavad Gita, or the Dharma is sacred to a Buddhist. I mean, to Christians, this is it. This is our text. And so, yes, it is going to be sacred. All right. Next week we pick up with C, some guidelines for making a decision. And when we do complete this section, we, as I said earlier, Ali, you weren't here yet. The next section is heavily on special revelation. So we're seeing Guthrie's argument. And remember, Guthrie, as a scholar of Barth, is probably going to land closer to Barth than he does with Calvin. And remember, Calvin was kind of in that middle camp. Calvin understood, or the way Calvin understood it was, God, you can move a certain amount through nature, a natural, and then God then reaches out to you. To where Bart said, doesn't work like that. Bart says God is the only one that moves you. Dead men don't walk. Right? And Bart would say, it is God who moves towards humanity, only. So that kind of gives you a hint on where Guthrie is going to be moving this. All right, we'll see everyone in church.